When you think about processing information, it often comes down to sequences, right?
Yeah.
Like trying to translate a sentence.
Yeah, exactly.
You've got words, but the meaning depends on how they relate, even if they're far apart in the sentence. The verb at the start, the object way at the end.
Absolutely. Or even summarizing a big document. You need to connect paragraph 1 with paragraph 20. Capturing those long-range dependencies, that's always been a tough nut to crack, especially for AI.
Right. And for a long time, the standard approach for AI models dealing with sequences, things like machine translation, was very step-by-step.
Totally. They built understanding sequentially. Step 1 informs step 2 informs step 3, and so on.
Like a chain reaction, yeah. But the source we're diving into today basically said, let's throw that whole idea out.
Pretty much. It was radical. We're talking about a paper that just changed everything. Attention is all you need. Even the title is, well, bold.
It really is.
It introduced this new model, the transformer, and said, forget the sequential processing of recurrent networks, forget the fixed windows of convolutional networks. We're going to rely only on this thing called attention.
Solely on attention. Wow. Okay, so that's our mission for this deep dive then. Let's unpack this paper. How does this transformer thing work without the old methods? How can attention do all the heavy lifting? And, why did it work so well?
Exactly. And for you listening, this isn't just some dusty old AI paper. Understanding the transformer, it's crucial. It's basically the foundation for so many of the powerful language AI tools you use or hear about constantly today. This paper really shifted the paradigm for sequence tasks.
Okay, let's set the scene first. Before the transformer crashed the party, what were the main models doing this sequence work? And what were their big problems?
So the dominant players were mostly recurrent neural networks, RNNs, and their, let's say, more capable variants like LSTMs and GRUs.
Right. Heard of those?
And their defining feature is that step-by-step processing. To figure out what's happening at position T, the model needs the result, the hidden state, from the previous position, T1.
So you can't process word 3 until you're completely done with word 2.
Precisely. And that inherent sequential nature, that's the big weakness the paper points out. It makes it really hard to parallelize the computation inside a single training example.
Wow.
Sure, you can run different sentences in parallel in a batch, but for one long sentence, you're fundamentally limited by that step-by-step dependency. It just slows down training massively, especially the longer the sequence gets.
Gotcha. Sequential means slow training on long stuff. Were people trying other ways to speed things up, maybe be more parallel?
Yeah, there were attempts. The paper mentions models using convolutional neural networks, CNNs, things like ByteNet and ConvS2S.
CNNs, like for images.
Kind of, yeah, but adapted for sequences. They could compute representations in parallel using these filters that look at small chunks or windows of the sequence. But, the paper argues, they had trouble really learning the connections between things that were far apart.
Why is that?
Because the number of steps or operations needed to link distant positions grows the further apart they are, linearly for one type, logarithmically for another, but still it wasn't a direct connection.
Okay, so RNNs, sequential, slow, maybe better long range theoretically, but hard to train. CNNs, parallel, faster, but maybe not as good at those really long distance relationships.
That's a good summary of the situation back then. And it's worth noting, attention mechanisms did exist before this paper.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, but they were usually used with RNNs. Like an RNN would process the sequence, and then an attention layer on top might help it focus on the most relevant parts of the input when generating the output. It was an add-on, a booster, not the main engine.
Until this paper came along and said, attention is all you need.
Exactly. Let's just build the whole thing out of attention.
Okay, let's look inside this transformer then. How does it work if it throws out recurrence and convolutions?
Well, first off, it keeps a familiar overall structure, the encoder-decoder model. Lots of sequence-to-sequence tasks use this.
Right, like the encoder reads the input sentence, say in English.
Digests it, turns it into some kind of rich representation. Then the decoder takes that representation and generates the output sequence, like the German translation, one word or token at a time.
Standard stuff there. So the magic is inside the encoder and decoder blocks. What are they made of?
They're both built from a stack of identical layers. The paper used N6 layers in their base model for both the encoder and the decoder.
6 layers deep. Okay, let's start with the encoder layer. What's in one of those?
Each encoder layer has 2 main parts, 2 sublayers. First, there's a multi-head self-attention mechanism. We'll definitely need to dig into that name.
Self-attention. Okay. And the second part?
The second is a pretty simple, position-wise, fully connected feed-forward network.
Position-wise, meaning it looks at each word's representation individually.
Exactly. The same network is applied to each position, but it doesn't mix information between positions. That's the attention layer's job. Now, really important, around each of these two sublayers, they add two things: a residual connection and layer normalization.
Residual connection, that's like a shortcut, right? Helps information flow.
Precisely. It adds the input of the sublayer to its output, helps with training deep networks, avoids vanishing gradients, and layer normalization helps stabilize the numbers, keeps the activations in a good range during training.
Okay, so input, self-attention, add input and normalize, feed forward and normalize. That's one encoder layer.
That's the flow for one encoder layer, yes. And you stack 6 of those.
Got it. What about the decoder layers? Similar.
Very similar. Also, NS6 layers, also with residuals and layer norm. Each decoder layer also has the multi-head self-attention and the position-wise feed-forward network. But critically, it inserts a third sublayer in between those two.
A third one. What's its job?
This third sublayer performs multi-head attention, but not self-attention. It performs attention over the output of the encoder stack.
Ah, okay. So that's the connection. The decoder can look back at the encoded input sentence while it's generating the output.
Exactly. It allows the decoder, at each step of generating the translation, to pay attention to the most relevant parts of the original source sentence, as represented by the encoder's final output. It's like the attention mechanisms used in older models, but now built into this purely attention-based structure.
Makes sense. Anything else different in the decoder?
One more key detail. The self-attention sublayer in the decoder, the first sublayer, is masked.
Masked. Like hidden.
Kind of. It means that when the decoder is calculating the attention for, say, the third output word it's about to generate, it's only allowed to attend to the first and second words it already generated, plus itself. It can't peek ahead and look at words 4, 5, 6, etc. that haven't been created yet.
Okay, that makes sense. It has to generate word by word based only on the input and what it's already produced. Keeps it causal.
Exactly. That preserves the autoregressive property generating one element at a time.
All right, so high level. Encoder-decoder stacks. Encoder layers use self-attention and feed forward. Decoder layers use masked self-attention, then encoder-decoder attention, then feed forward. Residuals and layer norm all over the place.
That's the architecture in a nutshell.
Now, the core, this attention mechanism, how does it actually work? And why multi-head? What's that about?
Okay, so fundamentally, an attention function takes 3 things as input: a query, and a set of keys and values.
Query, keys, values, like a database lookup.
That's a great analogy. The query is like, what am I looking for right now? The keys are associated with the values, acting like labels or descriptors for the information stored in the values. The attention mechanism calculates how well the query matches each key.
Okay.
These match scores are then used to calculate weights, basically, how much attention to pay to each corresponding value. The final output is a weighted sum of all the values, where the values with keys that best match the query get the highest weights.
So it finds the most relevant values based on how well their keys match the query and blends them together.
Precisely. And the specific type they use in the transformer is called scaled dot product attention.
Scaled dot product. Okay.
Here, the queries, keys, and values are all vectors. Let's say queries and keys have dimension dk and values have dimension dv. To get the match score between a query and a key, you just compute their dot product. Simple enough. Then you take all those dot products, one for the query against every key, and you divide them by the square root of dk. That's the scaled part.
Why scale? Why square root of dk? Seems specific.
It's a crucial detail for training stability. The paper points out that if dk gets large, the dot products can also get very large, pushing very large numbers into the next step, the softmax function.
Softmax. That turns the scores into weights that sum to 1.
Exactly. But softmax has trouble with very large input values. The gradients become tiny, vanish, and the model stops learning effectively. Scaling by root dk keeps the dot products in a nicer range, preventing the softmax from saturating. It's a practical trick that helps training.
Okay, so dot products for similarity, scale them, softmax for weights, then use those weights to average the values.
You got it. That gives you the output vector for that query. And they mentioned this dot product attention is faster and more memory efficient than alternatives because it uses optimized matrix multiplications.
Right, so that's one attention calculation. What about multi-head?
So instead of just doing that one big attention calculation using the model's full representation dimension, say D-model 512, they found it's better to first project the queries, keys, and values multiple times into lower dimensional spaces using different learned linear transformations. They do this h times in parallel, so you end up with h different sets of lower dimensional q, k, v vectors.
So it's like giving the model h different perspectives or ways to look at the relationships.
That's a perfect way to put it. Each of these parallel projections and subsequent attention calculations is called an attention head.
Okay.
You run the scaled dot product attention independently and in parallel for each head. This gives you H different output vectors.
Right.
Then you just concatenate those H output vectors back together and pass them through one final linear projection layer to get the final output for the multi-head attention block.
Why is that better than just one big head?
The intuition in the paper is that it allows the model to jointly attend to information from different representation subspaces at different positions. Basically, different heads can learn to focus on different types of information or relationships simultaneously.
So one head might track grammatical structure, another might track semantic meaning or coreference.
Potentially, yes. It gives the model more flexibility to capture diverse patterns. They used H8 heads in their base model, and they set the dimensions for each head, dk, a dv, to be d model equal 5128 equals 64. This cleverly keeps the total computation roughly the same as a single head with the full dimension.
Smart. So multiple perspectives without extra cost. And you said this multi-head attention shows up in 3 key places.
Correct. Let's recap them.
Okay.
1. Encoder self-attention. Here, the query, key, and value all come from the output of the previous layer in the encoder. It lets every position in the input sequence attend to every other position in the input sequence, finding internal relationships.
Right. Input talking to itself.
2. Decoder self-attention, similar idea. Q, K, V all come from the previous decoder layer's output, but crucially, this one is masked. So each position in the output sequence attends to previous positions, including itself, in the output sequence, understanding what it has generated so far.
Got it. Output talking to its past self.
And 3, encoder-decoder attention. This is the bridge. Queries come from the decoder, specifically from the output of the masked self-attention sublayer. Keys and values come from the final output of the encoder. This lets every position in the decoder attend to all positions in the input sequence. This is where the translation really happens, linking output words back to relevant input words.
Okay, that paints a really clear picture of how attention allows all these different parts to connect and share information. It's not just step by step anymore.
Exactly. It's about dynamically figuring out relevance across the entire input and the generated output.
So besides the attention mechanisms, the residuals, the layer norm,
Yeah.
what else is crucial in these layers? You mentioned the feed-forward networks.
Right. The position-wise feed-forward network, it comes after the attention sublayer in each encoder and decoder layer.
And acts on each position independently.
Yes. It's usually a 2-layer, fully connected network. So linear transformation, right LU activation, another linear transformation, applied identically to each position's vector representation.
What's its role? If attention mixes information across positions, what does this do?
You can think of it as doing some additional processing or transformation on the information at each position after it's been contextualized by the attention mechanism, maybe deepening the representation or extracting features. They use a surprisingly large inner dimension for this, DFF equals 2048 in the base model, compared to the model dimension of 512. So it expands, processes, then contracts back.
Interesting. So attention mixes globally, feed-forward processes locally.
That's a good way to summarize the flow within a layer. And then, of course, you have the standard pieces at the beginning and end, embeddings to turn input tokens into vectors.
Right, the D-model-sized vectors.
And a final linear layer plus a softmax at the very end of the decoder to turn the decoder's output vectors back into probabilities over the vocabulary, predicting the next word.
Standard stuff for sequence models.
Yeah, and they note they share the weight matrices between the embedding layers and that final pre-softmax linear layer, which is a pretty common technique to save parameters and potentially improve performance.
Okay, we've built this whole parallel processing machine with attention connecting everything. But wait, if there's no sequential RNN and no sliding CNN window, how does the model even know the order of the words? Doesn't the cat sat on the mat mean something different from the mat sat on the cat?
Absolutely critical point. You're right. The self-attention mechanism itself is permutation invariant. It doesn't inherently know about word order. If you just fed the word embeddings in, it wouldn't know which came first.
So how do they fix that?
They inject information about the position directly into the input. They add positional encodings to the word embeddings at the bottom of the encoder and decoder stacks.
Positional encodings.
Yeah.
What are they? Just like number 1 for the first word, 2 for the second.
Not quite that simple. They are vectors, the same dimension as the embedding D model, so you can just add them element-wise to the word embeddings. And the paper proposed a clever way to generate these vectors using sine and cosine functions of different frequencies.
Sine and cosine waves, like actual trigonometry.
Their hypothesis was twofold. First, using these periodic functions might allow the model to easily learn to attend based on relative positions. Since sin, A plus B, and cos A plus B can be expressed in terms of sin, cos sin B, cos B, the positional encoding for position pose plus K is a linear function of the encoding for position pose. This might make it easier to learn, look steps ahead behind.
Huh, that's clever.
Second, they thought this fixed, non-learned pattern might help the model generalize to sequence lengths longer than any it saw during training. They did also try learning the positional embeddings just like word embeddings. They found it worked almost identically to the fixed sinusoidal ones. So the key seems to be providing the positional information, maybe less about the specific method used.
Fascinating. So the parallel structure is powerful, but you still need to explicitly tell it where things are in the sequence.
Yeah, it shows position is vital, but you don't need sequential computation to incorporate it. You can just add it as another piece of input information.
Okay, so this brings us back to the big question. Why this radical shift? Why bet everything on attention? What are the core advantages the paper claims for self-attention over RNNs and CNNs?
They break it down really well, comparing on three main factors. The first, and maybe the biggest practical win, is parallelization.
We touched on that. RNNs are sequential, attention isn't.
Exactly. To compute the output for all positions in a sequence, a self-attention layer needs basically a constant number of sequential operations. You can think of it as O1 in terms of sequence steps because all positions are processed simultaneously via matrix multiplies. RNNs require ON, sequential operations, where N is the sequence length. This makes self-attention vastly more parallelizable on hardware like GPUs, leading to huge training speedups.
Right, massive speedup. Makes sense. What's next?
The second factor is the maximum path length for information to travel between any two positions in the sequence.
Path length. How many steps it takes for information from word A to influence the representation of word B?
Precisely. Learning long-range dependencies is hard if that path is long, because the signal can get diluted or distorted over many steps. In a self-attention layer, the path length between any two positions is O1.
O1, because they can directly attend to each other in one step.
Exactly. Regardless of how far apart they are, compare that to an RNN, where the path length is ON. The signal has to propagate step by step through all intermediate words.
Big difference.
Yeah. And even for convolutional layers, the path length is better than RNNs, maybe OA for simple CNNs or OLOC-N for dilated ones, but still not the constant O1 path of self-attention. This short path length is a key reason transformers are so good at capturing those long-distance relationships.
Okay, O1, parallelization, O1 path length, huge advantages. What about the raw computation per layer? Is attention more expensive?
That's the third factor, computational complexity per layer. Here, self-attention has a complexity of ON SOA E, where N is sequence length and D is the representation dimension.
N squared. Doesn't that get bad for long sequences?
It can, yes. But compare it to RNNs, which are ONDC, and typical CNNs, which are often OND, where IGS is kernel size. The paper points out that in many state-of-the-art models at the time, the dimension D was often quite large, sometimes larger than the typical sequence length in being processed at the layer level.
Ah, so if D is bigger than N, then ND or N can actually be more computation than ND, attention.
Exactly. In those common scenarios, self-attention could actually be computationally cheaper per layer than RNNs, on top of being way more parallelizable.
So the trade-off depends on sequence length versus vector dimension.
Right, and they do mention that for extremely long sequences where N becomes prohibitive, you could use restricted self-attention, where each position only attends to a neighborhood of size R. That reduces complexity to OND and increases path length to ONR, potentially still better than RNNs.
Okay. Any other benefits they mentioned?
Yeah, a nice side benefit,
Yeah.
interpretability. They included visualizations in the paper's appendix showing what different attention heads were focusing on.
Oh, cool. What do they show?
You could see some heads seem to learn to track syntactic dependencies, like linking verbs to subjects or objects, even across long distances. Other heads seem to focus on resolving anaphora, like connecting a pronoun back to the noun it refers to. It gives you a peek inside the black box.
That's really valuable, actually, seeing what relationships the model thinks are important.
Definitely. It provides some evidence about how it's processing the language, not just that it gets the right answer.
Okay, so we have strong theoretical arguments. Parallelism, short path lengths, sometimes lower complexity, and better interpretability. How did this translate into actual results? Did the transformer live up to the hype when they tested it?
Oh, absolutely. The results were pretty stunning, especially on machine translation tasks, which were the main focus. They tested on standard WMT 2014 benchmarks.
English to German, English to French. Those are tough.
Yep. And they achieved new state-of-the-art results using the BLEU score metric.
The LEU score higher is better translation quality, right?
Yeah, correct. Their big transformer model hit 28.4 BLEU on English to German and 41.8 on English to French.
How good were those scores back then?
Game-changing. That 28.4 on English to German wasn't just better than the previous best single model. It beat the best published results from ensembles, combining multiple models by over 2 full BLEU points. That's a huge leap. And the English to French score also set a new single model record.
Wow. So one transformer model beat collections of previous models. That's incredible. And I remember you saying it was more efficient too.
That's the kicker. They achieved these top-tier results using way less computational resources for training compared to the models they were beating. Their big model trained in just 3.5 days on 8 P100 GPUs.
Which was fast back then.
They called it a small fraction of the training costs of other competitive models. Even their smaller base model, which trained in only 12 hours on the same hardware, outperformed all previous single models.
Better results, faster and cheaper training. You can see why everyone got excited.
Exactly. It democratized state-of-the-art sequence modeling to some extent. Faster iteration, bigger models became feasible for more people.
Did they show it worked on tasks besides translation? To prove it wasn't just a one-trick pony?
Yes, they did. They applied it to English constituency parsing, basically figuring out the grammatical sentence structure, like a tree diagram.
A very different task.
Totally different. And the transformer did surprisingly well, achieving results better than most previous specialized parsers, even though it wasn't specifically designed for parsing and was trained on less data. That really demonstrated the architecture's general applicability to sequence problems.
And what about those experiments varying parts of the model? Did they confirm the design choices?
Yeah, the ablation studies, where they removed or changed things, generally supported their setup. They showed model size mattered, dropout helped, the attention key dimension scaling was important. And interestingly, as we mentioned, the learned positional embeddings performed about the same as the fixed sinusoidal ones, suggesting the exact method of encoding position was maybe less critical than just having that information present.
Okay. So let's wrap our heads around the big picture. What's the ultimate takeaway from attention is all you need? What's its legacy?
I mean, the biggest takeaway is simply that attention is enough. You don't need recurrence, you don't need convolution to achieve state-of-the-art on complex sequence tasks. Models based entirely on self-attention can outperform those older architectures.
They prove sufficiency.
And they showed why. It boils down to replacing that slow, sequential computation bottleneck with a highly parallelizable mechanism attention that can directly model relationships between any 2 points in a sequence, no matter the distance, leading to better quality and much faster training.
And this directly impacts you, the listener.
Yes. Because this transformer architecture became the blueprint, it's the fundamental building block underpinning almost all the major large language models developed since then. BERT, GPT-3, GPT-4, LeMNDA, PaLM, the list goes on. Understanding the transformer is basically understanding the engine inside modern language AI.
It really was a watershed moment.
Absolutely. A genuine paradigm shift.
Looking ahead, the authors even mentioned wanting to apply attention beyond text, right? To images, audio, video.
Yeah, they were already thinking about treating other data types as sequences or sets that attention could work on, and also exploring ways to make the generation side less sequential, perhaps generating multiple output tokens in parallel. Plus, crucially, they released their code.
Ah, open source. That was a turbocharged adoption.
Hugely. It let the whole research community jump in, build on it, improve it, leading to the rapid progress we've seen since.
So maybe a final thought for you to ponder. If this mechanism, attention, which is all about relating arbitrary points in data, regardless of their separation, proved so incredibly powerful for language, what might that suggest about how information is processed more generally? Could it hint at something fundamental about how complex systems, maybe even our own brains, handle information?
Or just think about the practical side, being able to efficiently process much, much longer sequences than before. What new kinds of AI applications does that unlock? Analyzing entire books, understanding complex dialogues, processing massive data sets in new ways. The potential stemming from this shift is still unfolding.